You're listening to Distraction Therapy with Rob Watson. Conversations about how we find meaning in our lives and what it's like to be part of a meta-modern world. Hello, this is Distraction Therapy with me, Rob Watson, and I'm joined again this week by Ryan Clayton.
Hello.
And we're again sat in a coffee shop here in Leicester, and there's lots of people sitting around enjoying their morning coffee. We've just ordered a couple, so they'll arrive hopefully in a few moments, and they will propel us through a conversation for the next 50 minutes or so.
While we chat a bunch of waffle and pretend we're quite smart.
Well, that's the nature of a podcast, isn't it? So, should we do that conversation first about what makes a good podcast?
Oh God, I don't know. I mean, I don't listen to many podcasts, to be honest. I only recently just started listening to a podcast. I wish I could remember the name of it. It's about comic books, and it's just a bunch of friends who get together and chat about the comic books that they've been reading. The Comics Collective is what it's called. And yeah, the only reason I really started listening to that is because I've got no friends who read comic books.
Who will talk to them about it.
Yeah, so it's like, it's just quite nice to sit there and listen to people chat about things that you're interested in, I suppose. I don't know.
Latte's that one. Thank you.
Cheers.
So the typical theme of this podcast is the idea of it's in the title of the podcast, distraction therapy. So there's certainly a need for some distraction therapy at the moment. So maybe we should focus around what we had a good conversation previously about the international situation, and I'm not saying that we don't talk about that specifically. We might move into that, but what have we been doing that have kind of enabled us not to feel overwhelmed by that, if you like? What is our distraction therapy has been through these times?
Well, for one, I've started reading the news a lot less. I'll tell you that much. But also, just the same as I usually do, really. There's been a lot of reading because it's been a couple of weeks since we've last had a conversation, and I've done my absolute best to try and exhaust all the unread books on my shelves. I finished reading a ton of comic books. Started reading a book about comic books. I put down the more serious Charlie Kaufman book for now because it's just a bit... I needed 4-colour superheroes to brighten up my existence, and so that's what I've been doing.
Yeah, those weighty philosophical tomes you can't really find much space in your mental capacity to get into them when you're exhausted from the information overload.
Yeah, exactly. I think the closest to anything serious I read was I worked my way through finally a comic book called Grant Morrison's The Invisibles, which is this very strange postmodern odyssey into the unreality of reality. It was fantastic, about a group of reality terrorists fighting against some kind of Lovecraftian, incomprehensible horror from a dimension just outside our own. It was fantastic.
It sounds like very Philip K. Dick.
Yeah, it was. There's a lot of shades of The Matrix in there as well, but slightly more fleshed out, slightly more fun. I only realised after finishing reading the thing that apparently it was a reference point for when they were making The Matrix, because it sort of started coming out in the early 90s, I think.
It is that thing of that kind of creative and symbolic kind of work that doesn't necessarily relate specifically to any one particular feature of our present times, but somehow seems to encompass and help us understand, if you like, the dystopian potential of the moment. Comic books are pretty good at that, I imagine. Not being a comic book aficionado like yourself.
Well, I mean, I think comic books are very good at a lot of things, especially when it comes to the more sort of imaginative and exploratory sides of popular culture, precisely because all you really need to make them, and this is a gross oversimplification, but typically they could be made with just a dude sat there at his drawing board and only limited by the bounds of his imagination, which is why I think for a long time now, and we're seeing it happen more and more, the comic book is definitely at the cutting edge of our popular culture, because, you know, there's just totally unexplored areas in comic books that haven't been touched by things like film.
And the simplicity of the written word, you just need a pen and a piece of paper. You can either draw or you can write.
Yeah.
And you can express, I mean, it's a gross simplification. You've got to have the imaginative capability to express it in the first place. I mean, when you look at comic books that you admire and artists and writers that you admire, what is it that you pick up on their traits, if you like, of what makes a good comic book author? I was going to use the word auteur then, but that was like, no, I don't want to use that at this point.
Stay away from that area of pretension for now. I don't know, because it is so varied, and I think this is one of the things that often goes overlooked when people talk about comic books. But to draw on two vastly different examples of people that I very, very much admire in the field is Jack Kirby, who, I mean, just a solid workhorse from like the 30s all the way through to the 70s and the 80s, responsible for the creation or co-creation, of Captain America, and then responsible for the creation of almost the entire Marvel universe as it stands today. Stan Lee stole a lot of the credit for some of the stuff that he did, but that's another story. And there's just a great imaginative, creative power in some of his stuff, like stuff that just sort of gets thrown away in an issue, like the idea of the Galactus trilogy and the Fantastic Four books he did, where it's just about essentially God coming back to Earth to stand in judgment on humanity, to find them lacking, and he's just this force of nature that just wants to eat planets and destroy life, and then it's over with in 3 issues, and suddenly Johnny Storm's going to college, and it's like, okay, we're moving on now, and there's just this constant non-stop flow of these massive ideas that are sort of just drawn out and expressed enough for them to be interesting, but they'd never overstay their welcome. You're always left wanting a little bit more. It's
a hint of something archetypal, something which is kind of deeply rooted in our narrative expectations about, myth.
Yeah, and there's a great, almost abstract simplicity to his work as well. The way that, like, the human figure becomes exaggerated in the fight scenes, and the raw, explosive power of his drawings is incredible, and that's one of the things that's always drawn me to a Jack Kirby comic. But then, on the other side of that, you've got people like Dan Clowes, who was the writer and artist behind things like Ghost World. I don't know if you've ever seen the film, but it's just this very intimate story about these 2 girls finding themselves and growing up, and it's still a bit of a weird story, but it's so intimate and grounded that it's almost it feels strange to have them both coexist in a medium that's traditionally associated with 4-color pop art of Captain America punching Hitler in the face.
I watched the first series of Young Wallander on Netflix, and it's just so depressing. It's like life's tough enough. I don't get that pull from Nordic murder mystery dramas where everything's depressing and it's about things that, obviously you want drama to reflect life, and it can be pretty miserable and depressing for a lot of people. But I kind of don't want to fill my head with it, but as a way to relax.
Yeah, no, it's interesting you bring it up because it's been something I've been thinking about a little bit recently because, my mum and dad are going through at the moment watching, rewatching, what is it? Call the Midwife and Silent Witness. And so whenever I walk into the room and they're watching TV, there'll just be a dead baby in its little crib, and everybody will be crying, and you just think, oh my god, like this is a bit much. Where's Superman?
Yeah, and yeah, I'm not. I don't want that emotional either toil or comfort blanket. And I find drama. I'm okay with some of the fantasy stuff, but I don't really want maybe it's a self-protection mechanism of I don't really want to put myself through that emotional ringer, even if it's by proxy in terms of watching a drama.
I think as well, the thing that stands out to me is it almost feels a bit like misery porn. Like, it's just people going through really horrible...
Welcome to British television.
Well, yeah, it's just people going through really horrible ish for the sake of it, like, all the time, relentlessly. And there's never any, because it's serialized television and it has to move forward, like Call the Midwife's a great example. Next week there'll be another dead baby or mother suffering from alcoholism who falls down the stairs and, has a stillbirth or whatever. And it's just, what am I supposed to be getting from this?
Well, I suppose it's tragedy, isn't it? It's and we have an endless fascination with the tragic, and it's almost as if this is the thing about when I reflect on why I've called this podcast series Distraction Therapy. It's like a regulated, so to call it a therapy suggests that there is a process that goes on of healing and growth. To call it a distraction suggests that there is then a process which is attached to it of identification, but distraction can be both a positive and a negative part of our lives. So we can delude ourselves by distracting ourselves endlessly with things that really are of no concern. But then we can also delude ourselves by over-focusing on things that we can't do anything about but are so tragic, that it's difficult to find a sure footing about where you should position yourself and how you should resolve yourself within that worldview. So it kind of just makes me wonder, how ill-equipped we are, and maybe I am, as to dealing with the harsh reality of life. But then I think the other side of it is, I think part of the reason why other people in general are kind of maybe not quite as, shall we say, socially well adjusted as I might anticipate that they ought to be, is because they watch too much downbeat television. They watch soap operas, and it just gets in people's heads that they then expect human nature to be something always entirely negative. So, betrayal, corruption, murder, manipulation, the standard drivers of, kind of any kind of classic British soap model or drama model seems to be the common theme. And that's even before we get to think about and talk about things like zombies and horror movies and why they're so prevalent.
Well, this is one of the things that I find so interesting about superheroes in particular. And I've had a strange relationship with sorry, just got to look from Rob to say I'm not holding it close enough. I've obviously become too relaxed. But yeah, this is what I find so interesting about superheroes. Despite having like a strange relationship with superhero comic books over the years, because it was, Superman comics are what made me fall in love with the medium, and then I sort of, as I explored comic books more, superheroes fell out of favour with me, and then I returned to them thinking about them a little bit more critically. And I think one of the enduring aspects of superheroes and why they've stuck around so well since 1938 and the invention of Superman to today, where, I mean, the Batman is now like one of the biggest films to come out ever, is they exist as opposed to, you know, drama and soap operas. They exist on a mythological level. They speak to archetypes, to human existence in a much more deeper and profound way than, you know, whatever woman is suffering currently on Call the Midwife, because you can always learn something about the human experience through what these people are going through. Like, I'll always come back to the Fantastic Four because I love those comic books. But at the core, the Fantastic Four exist as an archetype of the family unit, and what they go through, both biological and found family, and there'll be members that constantly switch in and out. And no matter what they go through, it always mirrors in some way or some form what families go through. And you can learn quite a lot just from reading some of the more well, even the trashier issues of Fantastic Four during the 90s.
Yeah, because there's patterns there. There's social patterns which are expressed, and I mean, I get, not to dismiss soap operas. They play an obvious social cultural function. Where I have a problem is if there's an over focus and an over reliance on one form of dramatic expression, as opposed to exploring. So if you were only, for example, listening to one kind of podcast and you were dogmatic about that, and you see this on the other interesting thing is kind of YouTube. So I've had quite a couple of busy weeks. So at the end of the evening when I'm relaxing, I'm finding I'm flicking through YouTube and things like alien discovery videos come up. This is what comes up on my YouTube feed, whether I want it or not. And you click onto them out of idle curiosity, and most of them are trash. Most of them are kind of really, just playing with you and to kind of titillating you to kind of draw you in to watch it and get that click. But if all I ever watched was these conspiracy theory videos, you could understand how you get drawn into that one-sidedness, and that you begin to construct a worldview around yourself, which is, this kind of environment of post-truth. And so if all you ever do is take on board information from comic books or soap operas, or even, some philosophers, if you only ever read one kind of model of engagement, then you're gonna run into trouble at some point, because you're not going to equip yourself with the whole breadth of skills, cognitive skills that you need to be able to engage with the world.
Yeah, well, I can relate to that quite severely. I was the guy in my philosophy course that only ever read Heidegger, and every philosophical problem got related through the lens of Heidegger, and it became a bit tedious. I think my lecturers were sick of me by the end of it.
Well, I mean, there's other people that could, in the pecking order of obsessions, that Heidegger's, kind of, they're a worse example. So
I suppose I could have been obsessed with, Scooby-Doo cartoons or something. But
it's like you kind of end up feeling like you're a broken record. But that's like there's a reason for that, and understanding that reason of why do we keep returning to these things. There's something that's not being satisfied, and we're digging away at something. And often, the classic psychological view of that would be that there's a complex being activated. Maybe there's something there which is like a dysfunction. But I kind of follow the idea now that actually it's pointing you in the direction of something. Yeah. There's a solution in there. So that being mindful of where your obsessions come from. So if you just can't stop reading comic books because there's something going on in your psyche that says, in your unconscious or the collective unconscious, that says there's something important in this and we need to pay attention to it. But we often think of that kind of sense of personal revelation as being popular culture, disposable popular culture, as being somehow, well, that's not where you're going to find this.
Yeah.
But it's exactly where you're going to find it, so we should be attentive to it.
Well, I think this is it's interesting you bring that up, because I feel like you've hit on something there. Like, my obsession with Heidegger at the time, I think, came from a kind of lingering sense that I wasn't getting enough out of life. Like, the key aspect of Heidegger's philosophy was to essentially turn the philosopher's gaze outwards again. Like, instead of sitting there in your room and thinking and being very rational and looking at things from a detached perspective, he said, well, what about the world? And then my obsession with Superman comics over the years, I think, has sort of mirrored a kind of an adjacent obsession of mine with authenticity and being the best version of yourself that you could possibly be. Because ultimately that's what superhero comics are about. They're about being the best version of yourself. They're about sort of... I'm trying to think of a better way of phrasing it, but...
Well, I think this is where it's put you in a direction of, first of all, my observation would be that the breakthrough is the fact that you've got a choice, or that you've got an option to be able to consider these things, which, just because you become obsessed with one writer and one philosophy at a particular time, doesn't mean to say that you're held to always being drawn to or shaped by that particular model of thinking. And actually, if you move it forward, you then start to say, well, we assimilate a number, and you look at the contradictions and you look at the opposites, and that's the journey of being able to then assimilate those different points of view and come up with something else. Where it relates to this idea, I mean, I'm not a big fan. I think it's that kind of postmodern notion of being the best version of yourself is bunkum, because again, reading Schopenhauer, where he talks about character, and actually, I have to say, I'm listening a lot to John Vervaeke's lectures on the meaning crisis, which he started in 2018. It's like 50 hours of this stuff. It's really good, and it's like a potted history of philosophy and the history of consciousness in particularly Western thought. And he used a phrase which in the last episode that we chatted, I didn't quite use the phrase properly, wisdom institutions.
Okay.
And that we are, part of the reason that we were in that existential angst that you described, when about not feeling capable of dealing with the situation or the world or your personal adjustment to that, or being able to adapt to the multifaceted nature of expected to be a version of yourself, that kind of thing. That is deeply rooted in the historical, philosophical journey that we've travelled through, and that what we are trying to do is do a meta, and what Vervaeke does is a meta overview of that, and puts it into a context of saying, no, this is part of a process of developmental consciousness, and you have to go through these stages of a process in order to become more proficient at that. However, life is something that you have to live, and you have to experience, and that shapes how you apply these ideas. So if you just sit in the philosophy seminar room, you're missing out on 3/4 of what you should be engaging with. So, go out and read comic books and talk to people and engage, do stuff, rather than just think about stuff.
It reminds me of something I read earlier in the week about I don't know how you pronounce it, but I think it's called a koan, Koan. It's kind of like a Zen Buddhist riddle, and the riddle is that you have this woman who places a gosling, a little baby goose, inside a glass jug, and feeds the goose and raises the goose until the goose is fully grown, and the goose can no longer get out of the bottle because the neck is too small. And how do you get the goose out of the glass bottle without hurting the goose or breaking the bottle? And in the story of the Zen Buddhist master who presents this riddle to his student, the student goes away and he meditates on it for a long time, weeks and weeks, and he comes back to the master and he says, I can't figure it out. I can't understand how I could possibly get the goose out of the bottle without breaking the bottle or hurting the goose. There's no way. And the Zen Buddhist master simply looks at him, claps his hands loudly in his face, shouts his name and says, "Look, the goose is free." Meaning that ultimately there is no goose inside a glass bottle. The goose is only in the bottle because you think the goose is in the bottle. It's a trick of linguistics. And as soon as you snap yourself out of thinking about it, the goose is free. And that ultimately, I feel like there's several lessons you can learn from thinking about it and meditating on it. But one of them is ultimately that life is to be lived, not to be thought about.
Yeah, and not just a trick of linguistics, but a trick of perception. And the object lesson is how you shift your perception to look at the problem and consider in what way you define a solution. And that's the challenge. How do you do that? And in part, it's like, what do you rely on? Do you rely on your inherited legacy expectations of solutions and definitions of situations? Whereas if you could probably sit down and come up with a whole list of fantastical, magical solutions, but we're thinking in terms of a practical and a cause and effect based solution, and the rigidity of material objects and the comprehension of what harm might mean. So when you analyse it and you break it down to each of its components, you realise something in a koan has got each word means something. It's a deep storehouse of potential meanings, which we, in our modern mind, aren't able to encounter or grapple with in any kind of significant way anymore, because we just see it as a kind of cause and effect. And it is, you mentioned the Matrix earlier as that moment, it's kind of there is no spoon moment in the Matrix.
There is no goose.
And I'm certainly not well up and informed about the kind of the Buddhist tradition and the Hindu tradition and the Taoist tradition of philosophical comprehension of states of being. But that's kind of what it's asking you to do, and there is a tradition there where we ask those questions and consider those things, and it feels alien to even try and address these issues, given the situation where we are now and how we tend to do things and look for answers and things.
Yeah, well, I think as well it's something that's hammered into you at every step through your development, from when you're a small kid to when you're an adult. When you're at school or whatever, you're taught to think about things logically and rigidly and within the confines of the rules of the problem. And that's one of the things I found particularly interesting about it's not really a riddle, but a riddle like that is that it can't be solved through traditional means. The riddle has to be dissolved from outside of the riddle's set rules. And that idea, there's a contradiction in there. It's something which is presented which can't be answered. One of the questions at the moment is the notion of propaganda and truth in the reporting and presentation of information and facts about the Ukraine war. And I think many people are concerned in the West that Russians are subject to an ideological regime of manipulation through propaganda, and that's enforced, and we've seen evidence of it being enforced by police brutality, state lockdowns, threats of imprisonment, all that kind of stuff. But it raises the question, at what point and how do people slip into that mode
of normalisation of their situation as it's presented to them, which we are all doing constantly, and how do we step outside of that to test what that, what there are, so we can clearly say, and we're quite comfortable in saying this from our perspective, that the Russian people in general are being deluded and manipulated. Well, it raises the question, are we being deluded and manipulated? How do we know? Is there a sense of objectivity that we can find a point where we can rest to make and validate any kind of truth claims outside of that?
Well, that's the difficulty, isn't it? Because you can never step outside of your own situation to view it in an objective manner. You're always trapped within it. So the idea that, it would be great if you could. I feel like it would solve quite a few problems, but it's easy for us to have a look at what's going on in Ukraine and see what's going on there for what it is, but not so easy for us to do it within our own context.
Because what it boils down to at the end of the day is that if it is competing truth claims and there is this equivalence, I wrote a blog the other day about this phrase which is going around at the moment about false equivalence, and that is there such a point that we can rest on, even though it might be contingent and temporary, to say this is more truthful than that?
I don't know.
Not ultimately.
I think I've been too corrupted by postmodern thinkers to be able to say yes to that question.
In what way?
In the way that, my mind, to begin with, almost like a bit of a nervous tick goes, what does truth mean anyway? Truth, that's not a thing that exists in any kind of real or objective fashion. Truth is mythological in nature. It's almost legendary. It's a story we tell ourselves and isn't really something that we can grasp onto. And so then it becomes, if you have one truth claim going up against another truth claim in a sort of ideological battle, who's the referee? What are the rules? How do you judge which one is in inverted commas truer than the other?
I suppose it comes down to how do you enforce that truth? To take the argument of which I don't accept that postmodern argument of relativism between truths, subjective truths, because I think there is such a thing as object reality, and that truth is humanly constructed, but we're bounded by our experience. However, your truth claim is only sustainable to the extent that you're prepared to back it up with force.
Wow.
Really? Well, ultimately it is, isn't it? It's at what point is that? That's kind of the brute reality of existence. Somebody tells you one thing, and the other person says, "Well, actually, we've got a better version of that, and we are gonna have a bigger stick to make sure that we."
And here's a knuckle sandwich to prove it.
Yeah, but that truth claim is always contested. But at the same time, I still feel that there is something that is grounded in reality. So this could spin off into metaphysics.
We're talking about the nature of reality now.
Yeah, quite exactly. And at what level does that become comprehensible and sustainable? And I draw it back to a pragmatist notion of, kind of Richard Rorty says this, is it's only as good. Your truth claims are only as good as long as they bake your bread, and that they, if it works for now, that's fine. But don't be surprised if what you regard as being truthful changes in the future, because the circumstances, the technological lens through which we apply this and look at it, and everything changes as well.
Yeah, well, that reminds me a lot of. Forgotten his first name, Collingwood, and who was it before him? But the notion of a paradigm shift. in science. The idea that these things are true up until they're not true, and that there has to be a paradigm shift to account for new modes of being, new ways of life, new facts that come to life, and ultimately, I suppose, then the truth becomes something fluid.
Well, this is the method. This is why John Vervaeke really does explain this, I think, quite well. I'm really impressed with it. It's the ability where you get your more advanced comprehension is in recognising that there is a developmental notion to those claims and the potential framework within which those claims are formed and framed. So what you're not saying is that you're looking at, philosophy as a process of comprehension, and that what you're engaged in, and you recognise the temporary and contingent nature of it, and that something may well change in the future, but we don't know what that is yet, and it has changed in the past, and we can look at how it was shaped in the past, but to kind of recognise that we need to deal with things now, and we need to deal with things in a way which are, I think that then what it brings in is the moral issue of, is this enforced through the barrel of a gun or a large stick, or is this freely expressed from individuals in an open public discourse? And I think when you that's the division. So if you are authoritarian and autocratic, by default, it's not truthful. If you are socially democratic and liberal in the way that you believe that ideas might come forward, then there's more chance that what you produce is truthful. That's kind of how I'd define it. Is that any good?
I don't know, actually, but no, it's interesting. I always love chatting with you, because I don't know if I've made this clear, but I've always really despised pragmatism and pragmatists. But it's interesting, at the very least, to be sort of...
Well, I think there's a popular notion of pragmatism about the kind of, you'll do anything to just get by.
Yeah.
That's not pragmatism as a philosophical expression.
Yeah.
It's that you actually, again, you sound more like a pragmatist when you say there's no Archimedean point on which we can change the world, external to our experience. That's pragmatism. What we do is grounded in we are humans, and we create experience. And everything we do is based on the defined, limited capability that we have as human beings. That's our starting point. And there's nothing outside of that we can recourse to. That's magical, mystical, whatever. It's within our experience. And that's what we have to look to. So what drives that? And we've very little understanding of what that is and how it works. We've only started to interrogate that. And we've avoided it in the West. We've avoided those kind of questions for a long time because we found solace in functionality.
Yeah,
it's something I'm drawn to, which is you're constantly looking to find the root. What's that point, that turning point, that pivot point that says if we just shift this slightly, we go off in a different direction. And words like, so I wrote this blog that I wrote the other day was about impartiality and objectivity, and our news media and information landscape, certainly here the institutional news landscape in the UK is, everybody talks about it in terms of impartiality, but impartiality is okay as a principle up to a point. And what impartiality suggests that if Putin is saying one thing and Biden is saying another thing, somewhere in the middle, and all you can do as the news presenters, the information presenters, is moderate between the 2 points.
Yeah, I suppose all you can do at that point is sit there and say, well, Putin said this.
Referee.
Yeah. Oh, well, Biden said this.
But there is no referee.
Yeah.
So what can we draw on? And this has a practical implication. So one of the things that was interesting, I was looking through some tweets, and the Bellingcat, I've started following Bellingcat, which is a news. They analyse and look at news. It's a charity that looks at the way that news is authenticated, and they've they've set up a system whereby they've got people looking at the video footage that comes out and the photographs that come out, because the metadata that's now included in those images and those videos has things like geolocation tags. And if it doesn't have a geolocation tag, then they were looking on and cross-referencing with things like Google Maps to make sure that, this was, because there's a lot of fake, the fake news stuff is people recycling things from other conflicts and saying, and putting claims in there that, this was happening and that was happening. And so what the process of verification is about is saying, no, this was located at that point, and if there's metadata in the file, that can't be faked. And this is an interesting idea about the way that technology is changing truthfulness in terms of verifiable. What's the word I'm looking for? Is that there's something which is different. So testimony, individual and institutional testimony, is the way that we used to understand whether something was truthful. So a reporter for the BBC was given high status, and still is given high status, because of the moral and ethical values of news reporting that are embedded and represented by that institution. But in a post-institutional world where the media production techniques are decentralised and outside of institutions, where we're suspicious of some of those institutions, then how do you verify truthfulness and who do you rely on? Part of the answer is to look at, one of the suggestions is that you look at things like the blockchain as a ledger of value, not just economic value, but the validity or veracity of the media that you're seeing. So, for example, if a photograph is doctored, then the original material has embedded within it a record of who produced that, where they produced that, and how it was produced. And that's carried within the digital data of that file itself, which there is a route to find out what the original content was.
I see. So it's no longer just free-floating images that you can there's no way of knowing where it came from or who's taken it or who's doctored it. It's like a digital ledger. You can open the book of the digital information and say, okay, well, this is the photo we've got, but look here, at this point in time, it's been doctored by this person.
Or it was uploaded from this Wi-Fi router in this particular cafe in this town at this time, and that's embedded. So every stage of use of that data. So I mean, the powerful thing about it is that it retains authorship with the originator, and that other people can't pass it off. So the blockchain will enable people to retain copyright and authorship over. So if I take a photograph in the street and it somehow is used around the world and used in lots of different situations, embedded in that photograph or embedded in that audio file is my metadata that is tied to a digital signature which relates to me.
Like a hidden watermark almost.
Yeah. But it's inherent within the data file itself.
Okay.
And that's how so this is the notion of financial transactions, and the cryptocurrency works is that the ownership of that, it can be transferred, but there's a record of that transference. And so that's what it's post-institutional. So you don't need banks to manage financial transactions. You use Bitcoin. And similarly, in the future, information and who you trust to provide that information, that verification and the trustworthiness of those people providing that information is going to come down to the level of who produced the file, where did they produce the file, when did they produce the file, is what it's purporting to capture, verifiable.
Yeah.
And that changes. I think that changes, and there's a lot of this now. So there's a lot on YouTube, and a lot of what the the institutional news media are doing, whether it's commercial or public service, is is spending time doing that verification now. So we're awash on social media of this just floods in, and it has to be filtered. Well, what happens if there is a kite mark, if you like, an embedded thumbprint, wherever it is, that tells you that this is from a reliable source that you can value? And so that notion, that implication of truthfulness is played out at a level which becomes very dispersed into social transaction, which we've never dealt with before. Everybody who takes a photograph becomes an agent in the production of truth, in a way that's never taken place before. We're all involved in that. It doesn't get filtered through institutions, universities, banks, media organisations, governments, that kind of thing. It becomes pushed down to this very dispersed, low level of engagement and transaction at the social level.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting at the very least. I think my understanding of blockchain and stuff comes almost entirely from what you've just told me now, but I do quite like the idea of decentralising things.
Yeah, for me, I don't really explore it as much as I should do, but it's a question of kind of how are we going to prepare ourselves? So the kind of conversations we have are about where do we fit within this notion of engagement with the world on the basis of validation and verification of our experience. How do we adjust and adapt ourselves to the world in a world that is trying to destabilise our certainties?
Yeah.
So that's going to become a more widespread problem because the technology is changing that facilitates how we consume information about the world, how we use and adapt and respond to information about the world, and the whole notion of fake media, and this comes down to the idea, ironically, that Putin is threatening anybody who contradicts his notion of what is going on in Ukraine can be imprisoned for up to 15 years. Ultimately, so that kind of bypasses that, because if there's a verification there, you can't really. Can you avoid that truth? Can you deny that took place? At what point there's a practical reality to this?
I suppose the only way you'd even manage to get around it is by sort of it's just by hiding it. It's just by making sure people don't have access to blockchain and stuff, and that people aren't using it, they aren't aware of it or whatever, which I suppose is, well, I don't know many people that are really I
suppose it's also why we shouldn't allow organisations like Meta and governments to control this and manipulate this model of transaction, because ultimately what you're doing with that is you're limiting the potential of something which could quite radically alter the way that we validate what we, how we understand the world, and who produces the information that we have about the world, and how that information is manipulated before it gets to us. So that postmodern angst of being concerned that we live in a world of almost endless manipulation and we don't know what truth is. I'm not saying this is the answer to it, but at least it maybe addresses some of the concerns about it.
Yeah, at the very least, on a sort of social, political, pragmatic sort of a dimension. Yeah, I can see that being a bit of a retort in those sort of areas. But my concern would then be it doesn't really have much of an answer when it comes to the more abstract questions, because then you're still left with the same sort of problems.
Which is why we still use myth and comic books to consider these things and try and comprehend them, because that's why they're equally as important. So, we're replete with an overload of news and information, but at the same time, also, whether it's an overload or not, a recourse to mythological expression and stories and what are we looking for in that kind of the figures, like look. I mean, at the moment, what's the name of the president of Ukraine? Zelensky. Have I got it right?
I'm terrible with names, but Zelensky.
And this heroic archetype that is being projected as, and what is it's something we've touched on before about the nature of the mythological storytelling. The interesting character now for me is not the hero. Heroes come and go. It's the redeemer or the person who is redeemed. That person, and that's kind of within us all. Of at some point in our life, we stop being the hero and we let those impulses fall aside. But then we're left with our question of, well, was all that worth it? And then you kind of look at the balance of your life and you say, well, this was either yes, it was worth it and I did my best, or no, it wasn't worth it. So who do you turn to give a sense of kind of... I was trying to understand what the meaning of the word redemption is, because it's kind of... We take it in the West from a Judeo-Christian model. And I'm not quite sure, and need to do some thinking about this in terms of, well, what actually is that point of redemption? It's that kind of return or acceptance of, it's like, you redeem something. It's like you redeem a ticket. You're paying for something and you're getting something. If that's it, I'm giving it back.
Yeah.
Or something. I'm not sure how to explore that yet.
Yeah, because I feel like redemption is one of those concepts when you hear it and there's an intuitive oh yeah, I know what that is, and then somebody goes, all right, well, what does it mean? And then you sit there for a bit and you're like, oh, how do I put that into words actually? So maybe it is something we should explore. And
the redemptive model that we have in Judeo-Christian thinking is it's an external redeemer. It's the God figure coming in, the Christ figure coming in. And if you don't ascribe to that model, then where do you get your redemption from? So we live a pretty tough life. Life is suffering. We have to put a lot of effort into all of this being that we struggle with. And then at some point we're going to ask the question, is it worth it? Well, who can answer that for us? Is it an external answer or is it an internal answer?
Yeah.
And that, I'm wondering whether that will, does that start to come through our popular culture at some point? Or are we just going to be constantly obsessed with heroes?
I don't know, maybe, because I feel like there are aspects at least where it's kind of seeping in. Like my understanding of Jesus Christ as a redeemer is sort of especially with what people have done with that idea, is it becomes less of an external redemption validation from Jesus Christ, and becomes more a point of inspiration, something that sparks an internal redeemer and sparks something within yourself to say, to then start re-evaluating your life. It's like, I think of, Superman is the great Christ analogue of the 20th century and the 21st century now. And the idea that Superman stands there in all his bright colours and sort of Christ-like glory and moral and ethical perfection isn't there to redeem you and save you, although that's something that he does. The real power that he has, and the same as Jesus Christ, is his ability to spark something in yourself. Exactly, yeah.
It's interesting, you sparked a thought, which is the last Spider-Man film and the redemption of the anti-heroes, the Green Goblin, and how the journey that was that's the interesting part of that film, and it kind of pushes the mythological narrative on a bit from purely the concentration on the hero with a one-sided baddie. And it actually just nudged it forward slightly to say, no, actually these baddies are more complex and they have a human dimension which is within us all, which we need to start to explore. The potential for redemption seems to me to be a theme that might be more of our times than the hero myth, the Joseph Campbell hero has 1,000 faces type of.
Well, the problem with that is it's just been so played out.
And it's facile. It hasn't got us anywhere.
No.
We're still subject to the same. Just wait for a good hero to come along, and that'll solve our problems.
But it hasn't solved a damn thing.
Yeah, exactly. So okay, let's wrap up because we've had a coffee blowout, a caffeine blowout here.
Yay.
So it's good for Saturday mornings. What is there anything that you kind of want to finish off on, kind of share that you think is a good recommendation to that you're using to manage your distractions?
One thing that's been really helpful, I'm only about 100 pages in at the moment, but I've started reading a book called Super Gods by Grant Morrison, who understands the superhero archetype better than anybody else in the business. And the book Super Gods is a history of the superhero from 1938 with the invention of Superman onwards, and what it means for our culture, and he places it very firmly within a mythological setting. Like, I think the first chapter is called something like the Sun God and the Dark Knight, with the kind of dualistic nature of the birth of Superman necessarily created the opposite in Batman. You've got the bright, colourful protector of the day, the Christ-like figure, and then you've got the kind of dark, brooding figure of the night and of vengeance in Batman. And he weaves together this history in a fantastic way. I couldn't recommend it enough. It's helped clarify a lot of my thoughts on comic book.
Okay, if somebody wants to get in contact with you, what's the best way?
Clayton Comics with an X instead of a C and an S.
And you can contact me at Rob W Media, which is on Twitter or Instagram, or if you want to email me, rob@robwatsonmedia.net. Thanks to Sound Art Radio for picking up these conversations, and Leicester Community Radio 2 for picking up these conversations, and until next time, thanks very much. You've been listening to Distraction Therapy with me, Rob Watson. Find out more at robwatsonmedia.net, or follow me on Instagram and Twitter at RobWMedia.